At the edge of an international border, at the edge of the Pacific, at the edge of innovation, community, education, and discovery, you're listening to At the Edge of It All, a University of San Diego podcast where USD experts speak on topics and stories that impact you and the broader community.
Hi, I'm Cameron Zeck.
And I'm Elena Gomez, and joining us on the podcast today is Kimya Massey. He is the Associate Vice President and Executive Director of Athletics here at the University of San Diego. Kimya, thanks so much for joining us.
Awesome to be here again.
Okay, so we're talking about a big settlement that happened. A federal judge approved a multi-billion-dollar class action legal settlement known as House versus NCAA. This is a big deal for college sports, so we want to dive into all of that. Tell us a little bit about what the settlement means and what happened.
Yeah, first and foremost, thanks for having me. This is a really complicated, longitudinal type topic, so I'm glad we're addressing it today. And this is the biggest change in collegiate athletics probably since Title IX. You know, there's been a few times in the history of collegiate athletics, starting in 1906 when NCAA was born, and then Title IX, 1972, and now this is really up there with probably the biggest change that we've ever had. So Judge Wilkin has been holding all the cards for a long time, and finally she's made the decision and approved the House settlement. And really this settlement evolved over several years, frankly, regarding the name, image, and likeness rights of athletes and their ability to earn revenue based on that NIL. And that's been something that's been discussed for years and years and years. And there's been a few cases along the way, and I think it really culminated with three particular cases. House is sort of the name that we all keep hearing, but there's really three cases that are a part of this particular settlement with the NCAA and, frankly, the power conferences that are out there. I think they've come to the conclusion, that this would be easier to do a settlement versus try to work through the court system and solve all these different court cases over the next several years, which would be literally billions and billions of dollars. That being said, the settlement will end up being about $2.9 billion in back pay to student athletes who participated between 2016 and 2024, but really centering around the name, image, and likeness rights and their ability to earn money from that. So that's sort of the crux of it at the 30,000-foot level. There's a lot of layers in there. But we are in a new era. We are in the revenue sharing era starting July 1st. And there's some really good things about it, and there's a lot of rabbit holes about it too as well. So I'm looking forward to diving in.
Yeah. And, you touched on the back pay and then revenue sharing. Can you just explain a little bit more about where this back pay money is coming from, and then the revenue sharing, where that money is coming from to pay for these athletes? Because now universities are going to be paying their athletes, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So let's start with the back pay. So many lawyers have been working on this and not knowing all the specifics of how we got to that number with the algorithm that came into place. Ultimately, the NCAA membership pays for this. The NCAA itself with some of their funds, but also us. We're all members, and we are all paying for this. And whether you're USD or San Diego State or an Oregon State or an Oklahoma State or University of Maine, it doesn't matter. We all have some pay that will come from this. And we are basically, just a long story short, we get a distribution every year from the NCAA for a variety of different things. So essentially, this comes out of our distribution. Our distributions are being cut short for the next 10 years under this settlement. Based on your school size and conference is sort of how big that cut in your distribution is. So our cut is what it is. And then if you're in the Big Ten or the SEC, your cut is probably 8 to 9 times bigger than what ours is. So all of us are having a distribution cut, which is really challenging, because a lot of schools are already struggling financially to try to make things work and provide the basic things you need for your athletes to be successful academically, support their student-athlete development, obviously compliance, how we travel, equipment, food, salaries, all those things. So this is a cut in our distribution over the next 10 years to go towards the back pay. So that's all Division I institutions. So I just want to make that very clear. The second part of your question, I think, was referring to the new revenue share and where that money's coming from. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
And that's coming from a variety of different buckets. As I think about revenue that a typical institution does receive on a yearly basis, the biggest bucket typically is ticket sales. There's also multimedia rights, which comes from the distribution from your conference. Some conferences, like example, the Big Ten, the SEC, ACC, Big 12, the Power Four, that multimedia rights distribution is rather significant. It could range anywhere from $30 million in the Big 12 up to 75, 80 million in the SEC, Big 10, right? We're much lower than that in the WCC, obviously. Our distributions are much, much smaller, but that is a revenue source. And then there's, of course, ticket sales, like I mentioned. There's sponsorship. So sponsorship that you work with like the Learfields of the world, the Van Wagners, for us, JMI here in town. That's another revenue bucket. Fundraising, university subsidies, and then, of course, facility rentals, things like that. So those are all those revenue buckets. So the money that will be going back to the athletes essentially is coming from a revenue distribution that might come from all those different buckets.
Taking a step back to the settlement, and it adds a lot of complexities now to, collegiate sports and athletic departments. What do you think the settlement, in your opinion, shows how college athletics has evolved and where it's heading now?
Yeah, where it's headed now, great question. I wish you could tell me. We think we might have an idea, but we don't really know. I mean, things have changed so significantly in the last 4 years with NIL. It's hard to say where we're headed next, and I do think we're going to see a lot more change in the next 2 to 3 years, even more than we've seen the last 2 or 3 years. I think the settlement signals an attempt to try to provide some kind of equity in terms of how we're distributing money and how the revenue share is working. NIL, frankly, was off the rails. The train left the tracks, and it was really hard to get it back on the tracks. Every state had a different bill. The way they did NIL was different from state to state. What Alabama did was different than Tennessee, different from Oklahoma, different from California. So that was really challenging. The roster turnover with the transfer portal, really challenging, but it was tied very much to NIL. Schools were recruiting athletes based on what their NIL dollars were, and they still are to an extent. What the settlement is hopefully going to provide is a salary cap, if you will, of $20.5 million. Mm-hmm. We won't be anywhere close to that, but that is the cap for all Division I schools. So that's equitable across the board for everybody. So hopefully that maybe reins in some of this to an extent, to one level. The roster limits now have been put in place where every school's roster limit by sport would be the same. And hopefully it allows schools to be able to decide, okay, how much revenue do we want to share? What makes sense for us at our institution, and not necessarily compare ourselves to the other institution, although we know that happens. So I think the settlement was attempting for the next 10 years to try to create some kind of equality across the board where the limits are the same. That's the attempt. Will that happen? Maybe, maybe not. With that cap I mentioned before, you can still do outside NIL deals through a third party or a collective that can add on to that as part of this. So who's to say that number could be really much, much higher than 20.5 for the Power 4 schools? Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say for our level, obviously, but that'll be really interesting to see how that evolves over these next several years.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of touched on this a little bit, but this will impact schools differently. How will it impact us here at the University of San Diego for our student athletes?
Yeah, it will have an impact as we have decided to opt into this settlement. Schools have the option to opt out, which would mean that they would stay essentially status quo. The roster limits of what they have been for many years would be in effect. And essentially, just FYI, most of the roster limit teams didn't have roster limits. Very few did. Also, the NIL piece would have to come from the outside, the third-party collective. We opted in because we felt like to be competitive in the WCC, specifically around men's basketball, that we need to be able to have the same resource levels as our peers. Men's basketball does provide a level of revenue when things are going well and we're successful that just really surpasses any other sport, and it allows us to give back to other sports. I would also probably throw in women's basketball and volleyball to that. Those are probably the three sports we can actually make true revenue, and that exceeds what our operations are, and then we can redistribute that funding. So we just felt like it was important for us to be competitive at the highest levels and to be opted in, which does trigger the roster limits and things of that nature. In terms of the experience of the athletes, it does change things because you do have athletes that will receive revenue share, specifically in a few sports, and that is it's a different world. We just haven't dealt with this before. and trying to ensure that our student athletes who are receiving funds through revenue share are being financially smart with it. There is a taxability component to this that students are going to have to deal with, just like any adult would have to deal with. And then there's other ramifications that will come with it that we'll see how it plays out in terms of like recruiting, how your roster changes over every year. This is a new budget item line essentially, and we would have to do a new budget for every year as the roster changes, and you do new negotiations. So it's a whole new world, but at the end of the day, I think we need to make sure we keep the focus on the athlete's experience, both in the classroom, the way we obviously travel, food, nutrition, health and wellness. All those things are still valid, and that's really the primary focus of what we're trying to do outside of what's happening with the revenue share part. But it will be interesting to see what the impact will be on a day-to-day basis, both for our coaching staff as well as the student athletes.
And so now that universities can pay athletes directly, how do you think this will change the recruiting process overall?
It's going to have a major effect. It already has with NIL in terms of both the recruitment and the retention side. It'll be really interesting to see athletes who excel athletically. Their value is going to shoot up. And then you have athletes who maybe don't excel or don't play as much or potentially get injured. Their value could go down. So you're going to be dealing with a roster that might be literally changing as the season goes on in terms of people's values up and down. And we're not like the NBA or Major League Baseball or football, where these athletes in those leagues have multi-year contracts. So they know what they're getting paid over the next 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. This is year to year, which is really hard and challenging. And knowing that someone's stock is going up or down based on how they're playing is going to be really interesting when you get closer and closer to the end of the year when the portal opens up. And a lot of kids are just going to go in the portal, and they have been, just to check their value. Will I get more at this X school or Y school? So I think culture is going to be really important, that student athletes want to stay because they like the institution, they want to get a certain degree, they like their teammates, they like their coaches, and they feel really good about this place that they're at. And do they want to get paid? Of course they do. I don't blame them for that. But can we create a culture where we can get most of our athletes to stay and still be competitive here for us at USD, and still be able to accomplish all the other goals that they want to accomplish?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of in line with that. I feel like in this case, it's so new. We don't know what it's going to look like. But I mean, you're saying from year to year, it's going to be changing. Your team could be one way one year, the next year it's not. And I feel like money always changes things, right? Like now that you're getting paid, or like you said, like values are up and down. It seems like such a different game. Looking forward, how do you kind of keep that culture and keep the team going when someone's in one year, they're not the next? You have 2 new people coming in this. I mean, it's constantly evolving. How do you keep what's working now with all of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's basic tenets that are still in place. For example, we want to recruit highly competitive athletes, right? And, since the dawn of time, being competitive and wanting to win, I hope is still part of this, not just how much money can I get paid. I still want to win championships. Yeah. I still want to be competitive. I still want to represent the USD on my jersey. And I think about individuals like us who have jobs and we get paid to do our jobs. Hopefully you come to work every day and you still feel valued, right? And you still feel like my supervisor cares about my progress and my development and allows me to get to the next step, whatever that is. And you hope the same thing for these 18 to 23-year-olds, that they feel like, oh, my development is still being cared for. My personal well-being is still really important, despite what I'm making, with my quote-unquote salary or what I'm getting paid. I think those things are still valid. I really do, especially with 18 to 23-year-olds. They still have feelings. They still have emotions. We still have to have a care factor there. It does become a little more transactional feeling, for sure, I think what you're saying. Yeah. But I still think a lot of the basic tenets of what we are and who we are and how we want to provide for our athletes don't go away. And I think if we can still provide those at a very high level, again, we'll get athletes that want to be here, they want to stay here, and they feel like, oh, this place takes care of me. This school might want to pay me more, and maybe that's a factor. I get it. But I want to be here because of how I've treated, and the grass isn't always greener on the other side. I think the challenge in some of these sports is the people around the athletes that are pressuring them to make decisions that may not be the best decision. And that's one thing I think we found in the last several months and over the course of the last couple of years. It's not necessarily always the athletes. It's the people around them that are putting undue pressure on them to make a decision that may not be in their best interest.
And you mentioned earlier, we were talking about roster limits, and some teams are going to have reduced roster limits, and some have now a few more added to their to their teams. So I'm curious, how will that affect the different teams having those roster limits, and then also for high school juniors and seniors that maybe wanting to come and play a college sport? Is it going to be more competitive for them now that there's going to be people that might have been cut from teams that are experienced players in college? So I'm curious how this will all shape up.
Yeah, it does affect the current roster. There will be some athletes that may not be able to be on the team moving forward. One caveat in the settlement that actually pushed it back in terms of being approved was that the judge decided to amend it a bit to allow current teams now to have what we call a DSA. It's a designated student athlete. So if a coach can justify keeping 2 or 3 more athletes on their team over this new roster limit, you can actually designate them with this DSA label. And if the institution supports it, they can still stay on the roster until they either graduate or exhaust their eligibility, or if they were to transfer out. So it's given a little bit of a flexibility on the roster limit, to go down to the hard limit right away. Mm-hmm. So that's been helpful in some ways. To your other question about high school kids, junior college kids, frankly, there's going to be less opportunities. There really will, because with the way the portal works, a lot of coaches see experienced athletes out there who've played 2, 3, even 4 years, maybe in certain cases if they have a redshirt year. And they've had a lot of experience. They've played a lot of games. They've played a lot of minutes. They've been there. They've competed at this level. And some of these athletes may want to come here and they can fill a gap immediately versus the high school athlete coming in, although talented. You don't know. They've never played at this level. The adjustment's hard, right? Being a freshman in college is hard. So I think you're going to see a lot more transfer portal student athletes filling some of the gaps that the coaches want to fill versus high school kids. And that makes me sad, because you're going to see less and less opportunities. But I do think it's actually going to benefit maybe some of the smaller D1 institutions, also Division II and Division III. You might see some high school athletes going that route, and then maybe later transferring up if they have the numbers and the stats to prove themselves. So it's definitely going to be a little bit of a different case over the next several years. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
It's expected that a lot of this money will be going to football and basketball players. How will that impact other sports and those sports as well?
Yeah, the way the settlement was written, there's a much higher percentage that would go toward football and basketball, which have been and are the media. Most media rights deals are based on football and basketball, and there is a value there that's different, right or wrong. I do think it's going to have an impact, and I think about some of the sports that are still out there, working really hard every day, and they're doing the same things the basketball player is, the football player is, the soccer player, the tennis player, the golf player, doesn't matter. They're all working really hard, and some aren't going to be compensated based on market value or marketability. So I think that's going to be challenging for some athletes, although I think some also get it. If you look at the professional ranks, it's not that different, right? I think you see some sports and some organizations that just have a higher market value based on how many people watch the games. Like I think about the NFL. NFL's the king. I mean, they have by far the most marketability, and they're the most watched sport in the world. Thus, those organizations make more money, and the multimedia rights deal for the entire league is higher. So, and that gets distributed down to the athletes and the organizations. So it's feeling like a little bit of that. I feel like we're maybe almost as like a minor league to an extent. How the other athletes will react to that, I'm not sure yet, but this has actually been going on a little bit with NIL the last 4 years. And frankly, a lot of athletes are just, I'm not that interested. I'm busy. I got a lot of things going on in school. I want to be a college student. I'm really busy at my sport. I'm good. I don't need it. I don't need another thing on my plate. I think they'd all love to be paid, of course, but that's just not going to be the reality. So it will be interesting to see what else pops up from that, and hopefully not too many negative things, but inevitably I'm sure there will be some. Kind
of in line with that, the settlement obviously decided that colleges can pay students, and they thought, or the settlement sort of decided that paying college students for their sports activities was the way forward, I guess, in college sports. How do you think it will change? We kind of talked about how it will change the game. How do you think it will impact students directly to be getting this money, I guess, that they could potentially put towards school? I'm not sure exactly, that with the NIL, that's giving them extra money too. I'm just really curious as how you see it in athletics of this money of having students have way more money than they're ever probably used to,
Yeah.
and how that will impact them, their future. And I guess the settlement saying that this is kind of the way that college sports should be now.
Yeah. Over the last 4 years, the NIL, and I want to debunk a myth here. The vast perception was that all these athletes were making 6 figures or 7 figures, and that's not the case at all. The average NIL deal was less than $1,000. The vast majority of athletes were not making that much money. There are obviously that 1% to 2% that are outliers that were making really good money, and that was going to be the same for revenue share. I think with revenue share, you're definitely going to see a lot more athletes getting paid, specifically in a few sports. But I do think there's going to be an impact. I think in some ways it could be really positive. I think some of the athletes will be really smart with this money. They'll put it away. They'll invest it. They'll do things really smartly. And now they're going to leave college, and the vast majority still will not be pro athletes. But now they have a little bit of a nest egg, which is awesome, and they can help their families. I was actually listening to someone talk the other day about a story about an athlete who didn't have a lot of money, maybe a couple grand, over with some NIL deals last year, but he was able to fly his family in to see his games, which they lived really far away and they weren't able to see him play. And it was his senior year, and he finally had a little bit of money in his pocket, and he flew his family in to see him play his last year. He wasn't going to be a pro. So there's some really good stories like that. There's entrepreneurship opportunities that athletes can start their own LLC, and they can invest in themselves and invest in businesses and get a little bit of a head start. So there's a lot of positive things. On the flip side, inevitably, some of them will spend it all. Some of them will not pay their taxes. This is all taxable, by the way. Some of them will, unfortunately, be surrounded by people that don't have their best interests at heart, and they will be taking this money away from them or asking for loans and asking for things that the student athlete may not understand. They shouldn't give that away. Or these are the people who have been in their corner their whole life and they feel obligated to do that. So there's going to be some negative press and some negative stories too. But that's part of life. I think if you're going to accept money and funding and revenue, ultimately it's their decisions on what they do with it. We're going to make sure that we give them financial literacy. We're going to make sure that we give them tax literacy and give them at least some resources to make sure that they're hopefully making good decisions. But ultimately, they're going to have to make decisions, and they're going to have to hopefully make good ones. So we'll see.
Yeah.
And in anticipation of a decision on this settlement, before we wrap up, I'm curious, what has USD been doing over the past year, I guess, internally to get prepared for all of this?
Yeah. No, we've been doing a lot. I mean, I think over a year ago, we knew this was probably coming, and it was just a matter of when. And from time to time, we would get certain deadlines that we knew the judge had to hit in terms of sharing more information. So we've been preparing for this well over a year, and I think all of us in Division I or beyond even, number one, first and foremost, we know we have to raise more revenue, and we knew we have to figure out ways to do this. Institutions are not able to just provide a subsidy for this. That's just not going to work, whether you're a public or private school. At certain times, you can get some help from your institution. That's great. But ultimately, the athletic departments are going to have to self-generate this revenue. So as I think about how we sell tickets, I think about sponsorship, I think about a lot of different things of what we can do. So a few things that we've done over the course of years. Number one, we started working with JMI, which is going to be our multimedia rights partner. We've had very few sponsorships here at USD, only about 8 or 9. Awesome partners. We're going to keep them, but we should be closer to 40 or 50 partners. And that's more generated revenue from sponsors that comes in for us to help market them. So that's one big bucket, which I think will improve over the next several years, that we can pull from. Getting engagement, just getting people to games, going out and doing more group sales. Again, targeting those intentional groups. I think I talked about in an earlier podcast about how we get more people to fill the seats and get more ticket revenue. That's a huge one. So we've been working on that. And now with this summer, I feel like we're ahead of it. We've got out a lot more social media and promotion and marketing of our fall events and things that are coming up. So I feel like we're much farther ahead of where we were in the past. Facility rentals, we're going to be a lot more aggressive on renting our facilities out. We're hosting a Radies Invitational in November, of course. That's going to be a really good source of revenue for us to host that tournament around Thanksgiving. But we can do a lot more. We have incredible facilities, and we can do a lot more with that. And that's a big bucket that we can help fill. And then just being creative. Are there other ways that we can generate sources of revenue? that we can put into this item line now to help redistribute out to our athletes. So it's just being creative. We are going to hire a chief revenue officer. So that person's going to focus specifically on ticketing, marketing, and sponsorship. That's going to be their sole focus, is to raise revenue for our department, work with our community. And we're also working with a couple of sports marketing agencies to make sure that we're, again, doing the things we need to do to get people to games and hopefully have the incredible experience and they want to come back. So we've been preparing for this in a lot of different ways, and we've put some resources into this. So we feel really well prepared, and now we just got to get people to come to games, and we got to win. I mean, winning is a really big part of the equation, and we've won in a lot of our sports, and we need to continue to win in those sports, but we also need to win in women's basketball. We have to. So.
Well, Kimya, thank you so much for breaking the settlement down to us that aren't in the sports world like you are. So this was really helpful of just understanding it, and people at home can learn a little something about the settlement too and the future of college sports. So thanks so much for being with us.
Of course, anytime.
And if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to catch our next one.